I opened my front door and was greeted not by the usual chirping birds or the scent of morning dew, but by the sight of ducks, actual ducks, floating across my front lawn. A plastic flamingo bobbed gently next to my mailbox, which was half submerged in water. I took a step forward, only for my boot to vanish into a squelching mass of mud. Then came the kicker. A wooden sign, cheerfully hand-painted, floated past me reading, "Karen's Serenity Pond, Nature's Beauty Begins Here." My name wasn't Karen. This wasn't her land. And I hadn't given anyone permission to create a pond in my yard. In fact, as the county water inspector, I was the one who issued permits for things like this. And this so-called pond was not only illegal, it was personal. Because Karen, the self-declared HOA queen, had just turned my home into her fantasy water feature. The mess didn't begin with ducks. It began 3 weeks earlier with a subtle shift in the behavior of the HOA board. A new initiative had been proposed by Karen during the last community meeting, a beautification plan to create eco-friendly spaces in the neighborhood. She presented herself as an environmental visionary who wanted to bring serene natural vibes to the community. While that might have sounded charming to the other homeowners, it was the way she said it that raised flags for me. Karen was never someone who wanted to beautify things unless she could control them. And sure enough, her so-called eco-vision came with a massive budget, no permits, and no consultations. I knew something was brewing, but I hadn't expected it to erupt right into my front yard. The night before the disaster, there was a strange humming noise behind my house. I thought it was just maintenance crews checking the sprinklers. But when I looked out with my flashlight, I saw a trench had been dug, a deep one, snaking from the direction of the HOA's community irrigation system. It looked fresh, with muddy wheelbarrow tracks leading away under moonlight. I knew instantly this was an unauthorized diversion, and I had a sinking suspicion about where it was draining to. Sure enough, by morning it was undeniable. My yard had turned into a swamp. Frogs croaked from under the porch. Mosquitoes buzzed in a happy cloud above the new pond. My flower beds were drowned, and the water level was slowly creeping toward my garage. The community newspaper had already published a photo of the new, neighborhood pond with the caption, "Karen's Water Wonderland is open." They even praised the HOA president for bringing beauty to unused space. I stood there in disbelief, soaking wet up to my knees, staring at a problem that no one else seemed to realize was a total violation of local and federal code. When I confronted Karen later that afternoon, she was hosting a yoga class next to the water, complete with incense sticks and spa music playing from a Bluetooth speaker. She wore a sun hat 2 sizes too big and held a glass of cucumber water like she was the queen of some makeshift kingdom. When I asked her why she thought it was okay to redirect irrigation water into my yard, she blinked as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. "Oh," she said, adjusting her sunglasses, "the pond doesn't belong to anyone. It's for the community. Your yard just happened to be the best place for it. It's nature's will." I nearly choked on her smugness. "You rerouted controlled irrigation runoff onto private property. That's illegal." She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Not if it's for beautification." It took every fiber of self-restraint not to pull out my badge and lay down the law right there. But something inside me decided to wait. I wanted this to be handled by the book. I wanted her arrogance to be her own undoing. Besides, the more she talked, the more evidence she gave me. Over the next few days, I documented everything. I took hourly water level readings, photographed the trenches, mapped out the diverted lines, and even used my thermal camera to track the underground flow. The data showed that Karen had essentially created a dam behind the HOA clubhouse and released its water into a gully carved directly into my property. I didn't just have water, I had engineered flooding. Meanwhile, Karen was turning this disaster into a PR event. She hosted pond blessing ceremonies, invited neighborhood kids to throw bread for the ducks, and even had a local high school band perform at the launch of the lake. People didn't know that the lake was illegal, unfiltered, and sitting right on top of a fiber optic cable junction. If those lines shorted out under water pressure, the entire HOA neighborhood would lose power and internet for weeks. By Thursday, things escalated. I got a call from my friend Tom, who works for the Department of Utilities. He warned me that someone had tampered with the irrigation control valve behind the clubhouse, and it had my address logged as the new default drainage output. Karen had hard-coded her pond into the community system. Now it wasn't just runoff, it was being actively maintained. That's when I realized how far she was willing to go. Karen wasn't just entitled. She was dangerous. She didn't care whose yard she flooded or what system she violated, as long as her vision of a spa-like duck paradise came true. She was using HOA funds, unlicensed contractors, and neighborhood goodwill to fuel her fantasy. One morning I found a pile of stones stacked on my porch with a note attached. For your contribution to the new HOA ecosystem. With gratitude, K. It was meant to be a peace offering, but it felt more like a final insult. I didn't respond. Instead, I finalized my case report, wrapped it in a confidential manila envelope, and submitted it anonymously to the Environmental Violations Department. Karen's pond was a ticking time bomb, and the fuse was getting shorter. The next storm was forecast for Saturday. If she didn't stop, the whole situation could collapse, literally. I had no doubt she'd keep digging until something broke. And when it did, I'd be standing there with the paperwork, the proof, and the authority to shut it all down. She didn't know it yet, but her dream pond was about to become her biggest nightmare. Because I wasn't just her neighbor. I was the one person legally capable of draining every ounce of her little water empire, and I was about to start the process. Quietly. Legally. Devastatingly. The days that followed the flooding of my yard felt like I had been dropped into some twisted nature documentary directed by a suburban lunatic. The ducks that had once been an occasional flyover now treated my property as their permanent residence. A family of frogs had taken up refuge under my deck. Kids from the neighborhood had started calling my front yard Lake Karen, and were daring each other to jump in from the curb. And yet, amid this bizarre chaos, Karen strutted through the neighborhood like she'd just delivered us from drought and despair. Her social media pages were filled with captions like, "Making the neighborhood beautiful one pond at a time," and "Nature always finds a way, thanks to the HOA and yours truly." To add insult to injury, she even updated her HOA bio with the title Community Environmental Officer. That wasn't a real position. But in Karen's head, reality bent to her will. It didn't take long before she began to escalate her illusion of legitimacy. One morning, I saw a lanky man in hiking boots and a neon green vest kneeling by the edge of the pond with a clipboard. I approached him calmly, watching as he dipped a turkey baster into the water like it was some scientific instrument. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and replied, "Conducting an environmental impact assessment." He introduced himself as Jeff, a wetlands specialist. I knew immediately this guy was no official anything. For one, his clipboard was blank. 2, he was wearing flip-flops under the boot. And 3, he had a Bluetooth headset playing meditation music. Karen stood proudly beside him, as if she had brought in a Nobel-winning scientist. She beamed as Jeff declared the pond to be a promising ecological node with rich spiritual resonance. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled out my phone and recorded everything. Jeff's babble, Karen's self-congratulatory monologue, even the moment Jeff tried to release a goldfish into the pond and it promptly floated belly up. This was no ecosystem. This was a cesspool masquerading as a utopia. Worse, it was starting to leak. The water level had begun to encroach on my side driveway, and a patch of it was now seeping into the foundation trench of my garage. I tested the water myself and found alarming nitrate levels, probably from lawn fertilizer runoff that had no business stagnating in an open water body. But it didn't stop there. Karen decided to install decorations around the pond. At first it was simple garden gnomes, then came solar-powered fairy lights and a massive metal sculpture of a crane holding a lotus flower in its beak. She claimed it was an art installation representing inner peace and neighborhood unity. I watched as one of the neighborhood teens tried to swing from the sculpture and nearly fell into the water. The pond wasn't just illegal. It was dangerous. Still, the most absurd part of her campaign was the grand event she began promoting, Sunset Pondside, a celebration of community and stillness. Flyers were placed in everyone's mailbox with watercolor ducks, flowing script fonts, and a schedule that included wine tastings, live acoustic guitar, and even a guided breathing circle. All of this on what was still legally my yard. Karen didn't ask permission. She simply assumed she had every right to do it, and no one had yet told her otherwise. Why would they? She'd manipulated the HOA into thinking this was all part of a pre-approved green space improvement plan. Most residents had no idea she was using irrigation water illegally. She sold them the dream, and they drank the wine without question. I realized that while Karen was focused on optics, I needed to stay focused on proof. That's when I dove deeper into the infrastructure records for our development. I managed to get my hands on the original landscaping schematics and discovered something that made my stomach drop. The trench Karen had dug to divert water ran directly over an underground fiber optic cable installation installed by a private contractor for the HOA's internet system. The soil there wasn't supposed to be disturbed, let alone flooded. If those cables were compromised, it wouldn't just affect my home. It would knock out service for over 40 houses, and possibly cause a utility liability mess. Worse still, her trench crossed over a storm drain that was designed to redirect overflow to the city's water control basin. But with her new pond in the way, that drain was essentially clogged. Any significant rainfall could now result in localized flooding. What Karen saw as tranquility was a man-made dam about one thunderstorm away from becoming a neighborhood disaster. And that thunderstorm? It was coming in 2 days, according to the forecast. A major one. By now, I'd already begun assembling my report for the Department of Environmental Protection, complete with drone photos, water tests, topographical diagrams, and annotated map. But I wasn't ready to go nuclear just yet. I had a few more cards to play, starting with community awareness. I designed a simple flyer titled, "Did you approve this pond?" and listed facts without any emotion. Bullet points included no permits filed, trench over restricted fiber lines, flood risk imminent, and potential HOA fines exceeding $50,000. I printed 150 copies and dropped them in every mailbox at midnight like a suburban vigilante with a printer instead of a cape. By morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. A few residents called the HOA to ask if Karen had gotten clearance. One even posted a picture of the flyer on Reddit, and it made the front page of r/entitled people with the caption, "HOA Karen builds pond in neighbor's yard, claims it's a shared resource." Within 24 hours, the post had gone viral. Comments poured in, ranging from legal advice to hilarious Photoshop edits of Karen riding a swan. Karen was furious. She stormed down the street yelling about slander and neighborhood unity being under attack. She tried to rally a few loyalists to her side, but most of them were now asking questions she couldn't answer. Someone even asked her point-blank, "Why didn't you file a permit?" Her response was, "Permits are for people without vision." That quote alone got screenshotted and turned into a meme. Even I had to admit, it was almost impressive how detached she was from reality. Finally, Karen decided to try and reclaim control with an emergency HOA board meeting. She posted a notice that it would be held pondside under the evening stars, and that she would be making a major announcement. She even hired a guy with a guitar to play background music as people gathered. But I had other plans. I didn't RSVP. I didn't bring a folding chair. I simply showed up wearing my official water inspector badge on a lanyard. As I walked into the crowd, people turned and whispered, Karen froze mid-speech when she saw me. She tried to carry on, but her voice cracked. I let her speak first. I wanted her to say everything she believed, about how the pond was a gift to the neighborhood, about how it was good for the environment, about how people were ungrateful. I even let her quote a line from Thoreau. Then I cleared my throat, stepped forward, and pulled out a file folder the size of a college textbook. What I said next would shake the pond's waters to their core, but I wasn't done yet. Karen had crossed legal lines, environmental lines, and even social ones. But now she had crossed mine. And she had no idea just how bad it was about to get. The moment Karen saw the badge around my neck, her entire posture changed. Her confident stance wilted just slightly, but she tried to mask it with a fake smile and a forced chuckle, waving at the neighbors like this was just part of the plan. But the eyes around her weren't filled with admiration anymore. They were filled with suspicion. I walked straight up to her without saying a word and opened the folder I brought with me. The first few pages contained printed satellite images from our department's public-facing map. The pond she called a community feature was clearly shown sitting directly in the middle of my private property. The second section contained annotated photos of the illegal trench system and time-stamped footage from my own home's security system. Then came the documents she didn't expect, copies of the HOA development permit history, water use restrictions, and emails I'd gathered from a whistleblower detailing her misuse of community fund. Karen opened her mouth to object, but I raised one hand slightly and began to speak. I explained to the group, firmly, calmly, without raising my voice, that this pond was constructed illegally, that it redirected HOA irrigation runoff into a residential zone, that it crossed a utility trench with critical infrastructure beneath it, and most importantly, that it had been done without permits, inspections, engineering reports, or even a basic consultation with the county's water management authority. I let each sentence fall like a hammer onto a nail. The crowd stayed silent, save for the sound of distant frogs chirping in the background. I turned toward the crowd and said something I had saved for this exact moment. I informed them that as the county water inspector, I was filing an official citation for environmental negligence, that the pond not only posed a flood risk to neighboring homes but had already contaminated surface soil with nitrates, and that the runoff had bypassed a storm filtration system which violated a regional water ordinance. Several people gasped. Karen's face turned pale. She mumbled something about consulting her team, and then tried to pivot the conversation to community wellness. But the damage was already done. She couldn't hide behind duck statues and fairy lights anymore. I left the meeting after delivering my report. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. But the tension in the air was unmistakable. Karen didn't get applause that evening. She got questions, and not friendly ones. Neighbors wanted to know how she accessed the HOA irrigation plans, who approved the budget for the trench work, and why her name was on the payments to a company that didn't exist 6 months ago. Someone even asked whether she would be reimbursing them if the fines hit the HOA budget. Her charm had run dry, and all that was left was a murky pond and a murkier reputation. The next morning, retaliation came swiftly. I woke to the rumble of diesel engines and looked out to see dump trucks unloading mounds of dirt on my driveway. Not just dirt, mud, soaked with water and mixed with sod pieces. I couldn't even get my car out. I checked my security cameras and saw a landscaping crew in unmarked uniforms dumping the material. When I asked who hired them, the foreman just shrugged and said they were told to deliver erosion fill by someone named Carla. That was Karen's middle name. I didn't argue. I didn't even get mad. I documented everything, took more pictures, and then called the county to report an unauthorized land disturbance. But this wasn't just about muddy revenge. That same day, a neighbor sent me a link to a post Karen had made on the HOA community board. She claimed that I was creating legal trouble over a shared beautification project and accused me of retaliation against the HOA out of personal bitterness. She said my unauthorized photography and obsession with paperwork were disruptive and that she had reported me to the board for harassment. She even tried to twist the narrative, framing herself as a victim of an abusive neighbor. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to discredit me before the hammer dropped. That afternoon, I received a call from an anonymous number. The person on the other end was quiet at first, and then said, in a slightly nervous voice, that they worked maintenance for the HOA on weekends. They told me they were hired under the table by Karen to dig the trench behind the clubhouse, that she paid them in cash and told them to avoid being seen, that she claimed she had clearance. When they asked for work orders, she said everything was already filed. The voice then said they noticed something odd while digging. The trench went straight through a conduit box that wasn't supposed to be there. I asked if they took pictures. They did. They emailed them to me later that evening. And with that, I now had the last piece of the puzzle. The photos showed the trench breaking through a fiberglass vault box marked Data Protected Utility. The code number matched the line I'd seen in the infrastructure schematic. If water had seeped into that box, it could short-circuit the fiber for the entire HOA. Karen hadn't just broken zoning laws. She had put public utilities at risk of failure. It was no longer just an HOA issue. It was a matter for the state. I compiled all the documents and sent them to the Department of Environmental Protection and the County Utility Oversight Office. I also submitted an incident report directly to the state attorney's office, listing her actions under misuse of public resources and intentional sabotage of critical infrastructure. I didn't embellish. I didn't speculate. I just let the evidence speak for itself. Within 72 hours, I got a response. A team of investigators was being dispatched. They were bringing their own inspection tools, and they were coming with a warrant. That weekend, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors. People started noticing government SUVs parked on the street. 2 men in plain clothes stood by the community water vaults while a woman in boots took samples from the edge of the pond. Karen tried to act normal. She hosted another pondside peace tea gathering and passed out flyers about mental wellness and stress relief. But her eyes darted every time someone from the government walked by. She tried to engage the officials in conversation, but they ignored her. They were polite, professional, and entirely focused. They weren't here for chit-chat. They were here to shut her down. On Sunday afternoon, one of the investigators knocked on my door. He asked to confirm the trench entry points and whether I could give a walkthrough of where the runoff was entering. I led him across the yard, pointing out everything. He nodded, took pictures, and said, "She really thought no one would notice, didn't she?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The smell of algae, the sinking soil, the flickering street lamps on the edge of the cable zone, all of it was a testament to her arrogance. By Sunday evening, Karen's Serenity Pond was no longer a tranquil haven. Yellow flags marked hazardous zones. Tape cordoned off the trench area. The pond's water level had been marked with dye to track flow patterns. The fairy lights had been unplugged. The music had stopped. And Karen? She stood by her patio with a glass of wine that shook in her hand. The final blow came just before sunset. A letter from the county was hand-delivered to her by a uniformed official. It was a cease and desist. All further maintenance, even. The Monday morning following the cease and desist notice was quiet. Almost too quiet. The ducks were gone, the fairy lights were unplugged, and Karen's usual trail of incense smoke was noticeably absent from the air. But I knew better than to assume that Karen had finally accepted defeat. She wasn't the kind of person to surrender gracefully. In fact, when people like Karen are cornered, they don't retreat. They retaliate. And sure enough, by midday, retaliation came, not with a bang, but with the metallic clunk of my mailbox hitting the ground. I found it lying sideways in the mud, its post sawed clean through. At first glance, it might have looked like weather damage. But it hadn't rained, and the post had been intact for years. The cut was too clean, the break too deliberate. I reviewed the footage on my outdoor camera and saw a hooded figure approaching in the early hours. While the footage was grainy, I recognized the shape, the stance, the habitual flip of the wrist. Karen had personally come over and vandalized my property. I saved the footage and sent it straight to the local sheriff's office. Then I called my friend Doug in code enforcement and gave him a friendly heads-up. But that wasn't all. Later that afternoon, I received an official-looking envelope slipped under my door. It was printed with the HOA letterhead, though the formatting was sloppy. Inside was a formal complaint claiming that I had intentionally endangered community property by disrupting a shared recreational area, and it listed a number of made-up violations including emotional pollution and failure to maintain neighborly demeanor. It was ridiculous. It wasn't even signed by the full board, just Karen. She was clearly trying to build a case against me before the HOA fallout reached her doorstep. By now, the community had split. Half the residents were furious with her, especially after the inspection team's arrival, but some of her diehard supporters were still clinging to the fantasy she had built. They called me a snitch, a bureaucratic stick in the mud, and even accused me of sabotaging the pond out of jealousy. I ignored it all. I had no time for gossip when actual damage was unfolding. I knew the longer the pond sat in my yard, the greater the risk. The water table beneath my foundation was beginning to shift, and cracks had started forming in the corner of my garage. I hired a soil technician to confirm my suspicions. His report came back with exactly what I feared. The artificially pooled water had caused saturation beyond safe levels. If not addressed immediately, I'd be facing structural damage worth tens of thousands. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down on her propaganda. She started handing out homemade flyers titled, "Save Our Pond," with pictures of butterflies, lilies, and children feeding imaginary duck. She even tried to circulate a petition demanding that the county recognize her creation as a protected community wetland. Only a handful of residents signed it, mostly the same people who drank her cucumber wine and posted on Facebook about healing crystals. But it was enough noise that the HOA board was forced to schedule a vote on whether to formally remove her as president. That meeting was only days away. Karen must have sensed the walls closing in, because her next move was straight out of a bad crime novel. A neighbor named Jen, who had always kept to herself, came over that evening looking pale and uneasy. She had overheard something through her open bathroom window. Karen had been speaking on the phone, panicked and angry. She told whoever was on the other end that if things didn't go her way, she was going to create an emergency they couldn't ignore. Jen didn't know what that meant, but her tone was chilling. That night, I moved my truck to the back of the property and set up motion sensors on the front drive. I didn't know what Karen was planning, but I wasn't about to let her damage my home any further. The very next day, her threat became clear. A work crew arrived just after noon, 3 men with no visible company logos and a backhoe parked in the street. One of them knocked on my door and announced they were here to extend the pond border for HOA compliance. I laughed. Then I asked for paperwork. Of course, they had none. I demanded to see who had ordered the job. They said it came from Karen, head of neighborhood development. I told them if they so much as scratched the soil on my property, I'd have them arrested for trespassing. As they hesitated, 2 county vehicles turned the corner, an unplanned but perfectly timed patrol. The crew packed up and left without another word. I made sure to get photos of their truck's license plate before they vanished. By now, the state-level investigators had completed their assessment. I received a formal report confirming everything I had submitted, plus more. Karen had not only rerouted municipal water into a private yard without authorization, but she had also used HOA funds to pay unlicensed workers under fictitious contracts. One of the invoices they found listed a company called Aquazen Flow Solutions, a business that, after digging, turned out to be registered under a P.O. box tied to Karen's yoga instructor's name. It was fraud, plain and simple. The investigators issued a preliminary fine of $160,000, with additional charges pending depending on environmental repair costs. The HOA board was notified immediately, and the storm brewing finally erupted. Karen tried to spin the story one last time, blaming contractors, claiming that she was just trying to bring the community together, and even insisting that the water had naturally pooled there and she was simply enhancing it. But no one bought it anymore. Her web of lies was unraveling fast, and all she could do was watch as every thread snapped loose. At the emergency HOA board meeting held 2 nights later, the turnout was massive. More than 40 residents showed up, and this time they weren't there to sip sangria and talk about garden gnomes. They were angry and they were loud. I sat quietly in the back while the board read aloud the violations, the state's report, and the internal financial discrepancies they had uncovered. Karen, for once, didn't speak. She sat frozen, her hands clenching the armrests of her folding chair. The board took a vote. The result was unanimous. Karen was officially removed as HOA president and barred from serving on any HOA-related committee or project again. There was no applause. No cheering. Just a long, collective sigh of relief. Her reign had ended not with a showdown, but with quiet accountability and a stack of undeniable evidence. She left the meeting without a word, head down, her ever-present sun hat dangling uselessly from her wrist. The next day, the county sent a formal drainage crew to begin the cleanup process. I stood outside as the pumps began to drain the stagnant water from my yard. The smell was terrible, but I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I could see grass again. My property was returning to what it was. As the crew worked, one of them turned to me and said he'd never seen a case like this. I told him the truth. Neither had I. And I'd seen plenty. But this wasn't over yet. Karen had lost her power, but she hadn't. The final chapter in Karen's Pond saga didn't begin with more chaos. It began with silence, the kind that settles over a neighborhood when everyone's waiting for the fallout. After the pumps cleared the last of the murky water from my yard, all that remained was sludge, a few half-buried garden gnomes, and the faint outline of where the so-called Serenity pond had been. The frogs had scattered, the ducks had moved on, and Karen, who once treated the area like her private garden kingdom, was nowhere to be seen. Her porch sat empty, curtains drawn tight like a fortress under siege. For a few days, people wondered if she was gone for good, but no, she was still inside, holed up in her house while the world she built collapsed piece by piece. The HOA board sent out an official update to the community. Karen had been permanently removed, the budget would be audited, and any residents who experienced damage due to the pond were invited to file individual claims. My name was the first on that list. The structural engineer I hired found significant soil displacement beneath my garage slab. Though the damage hadn't yet cracked the foundation, it would cost thousands to stabilize. I filed a claim against the HOA, which was technically liable since the funds and trenching crew had been directed through them. But the real sting was still to come, because the HOA was now turning around and suing Karen to recover every cent. The insurance company had refused to cover anything related to the pond. Their reasoning was simple. The pond had not been a naturally occurring feature, nor was it sanctioned through proper channels. It was a private decision imposed on public infrastructure, a direct violation of nearly every policy clause. That left the HOA with a financial crater and one person to blame. Karen, for all her talk of beauty and tranquility, had saddled the community with more than $200,000 in environmental and legal penalties. The civil suit was swift and brutal. I was asked to testify, along with 3 other neighbors who had documented trench digging and water damage. Karen's defense, what little there was, hinged on the idea that she genuinely believed she had the authority to modify common areas for the community's benefit. But the documents spoke louder. Invoices made out to shell companies she had created, payment logs from HOA accounts she'd accessed without board approval, and emails where she explicitly instructed workers to avoid inspectors. All of it painted a picture not of innocence but manipulation. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled in favor of the HOA. Karen was ordered to pay restitution, banned from holding any administrative position in the community, and placed under court-supervised financial management until the debt was addressed. She tried to appeal, of course, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, blamed the contractors, the inspectors, even the weather. But none of it worked. The ruling stood, and word spread quickly. Even people who once supported her began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped arriving at her door. The social circles she once dominated evaporated overnight. Her reputation, once cemented in the HOA's legacy, was now synonymous with fraud and public embarrassment. Not long after, I received an unexpected visit from the County Director of Environmental Safety. She had heard about the case through the official channels and wanted to tour the site herself. She asked questions, examined the drain lines, even commented on the absurdity of how easily someone had redirected a municipal system for personal use. She told me they were drafting new protocols to prevent this sort of incident from happening again. She even offered me a position as a consultant for a water security task force. It was a moment of poetic justice. The woman who had tried to bury me in mud had accidentally elevated my career. But even as justice was served, I couldn't help but look at the damage around me. The pond had gone, but the grass hadn't returned. The soil was still damp and unstable, and the ecosystem had been disturbed beyond recognition. I hired a landscaping crew to regrade the area, install new drainage paths, and plant fresh grass seed. I also decided to take things a step further. If the neighborhood was going to have a water feature, it would be one built properly, legally, and beneficial to everyone. I used my inspector credentials and some contacts in local government to secure approval for a rain harvesting and conservation education site. What once had been Lake Karen was soon transformed into a model of sustainable landscaping. Rain barrels, native plants, permeable stone walkways, and educational signage all went in. I even held a small open house for the neighborhood to show how water, when handled responsibly, could bring real beauty without harm. The kids came back, not to throw bread at ducks, but to learn about frogs and water cycles. The adults came back too, curious then impressed. What had once been a symbol of Karen's tyranny was now a badge of communal resilience. The county even gave me a small plaque for my efforts, which I placed discreetly near the corner, behind a butterfly bush. It wasn't about accolades, it was about restoring something real. As for Karen, things only got worse. Her home insurance, after reviewing the case and structural issues caused by the unauthorized trenching, dropped her policy. Heavy rains that fall revealed a fatal flaw in her landscaping. Water now pooled directly under her back deck. Mold grew in her crawlspace. Contractors refused to work with her due to the pending legal dispute. She had to sell her furniture, then her car, and finally, she put her house on the market. But with her name in the headlines and a property riddled with code violations, no one wanted to buy. Eventually, she disappeared. Some said she moved in with her sister in another state. Others claimed she was still sending angry emails to the HOA from an unknown location. I didn't care. She was gone. And that was enough. Months later, I was out in the yard, trimming back the tall grasses near the water barrels, when a small boy from the neighborhood came up to me. He pointed at the area that used to be the pond and asked why it looked so different now. I knelt down and told him the truth. That once, someone tried to build something here the wrong way. But then the neighborhood worked together to fix it. He nodded and said he liked the butterflies better anyway. Then he asked if he could help plant flowers. In that moment, I realized the story wasn't just about Karen. It was about what happens when one person abuses power, and what a community can do when it finally stands up. It was about the long fight, the quiet documentation, the right mix of patience and action. And maybe, just maybe, it was about redemption. Not for her, but for the ground, the people, and the homes that had been affected. This wasn't just a backyard anymore. It was proof that the system, though flawed, could still work when people refused to be walked on or flooded out. By spring, my yard was green again. Birds returned to the trees. The smell of mud was replaced with jasmine and rosemary. And on the far edge of the yard, where the water used to pool deepest, I placed one final reminder. Not a plaque or a statue. Just a small wooden sign that read "Let the water rise, but never over your dignity." It wasn't there for the neighbors. It was there for me. Because I'd survived a war disguised as a pond. And I'd won.